G'day viewers. In this segment I'll talk about the history of TCP congestion control. So we've talked about congestion control in general, including the additive increase, multiplicative decrease control law. In the following segments we're going to dive into the details of TCP in particular to find out how it implements congestion control and comes up with a bandwidth allocation. Before we do that, however, I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about the history of TCP congestion control, because it's a colourful story involving congestion collapse, new mechanisms to control it, and a diversity of mechanisms which we've reached today. So in the late 1980s, the mid to late 1980s, as the internet grew, the earlier designs for TCP in fact used a fixed size sliding window. Some machines, for instance, used 8 packets. This worked reasonably well for reliability, but as you can see here, something strange happened as the ARPANET grew. In particular, the network got into a state called congestion collapse, where the links were all very busy sending packets, but the end-to-end good put or useful information which went through the network plunged through the floor. Here's a picture from before about congestion collapse. We really got into this situation where the queues became very full. There were many retransmissions which were clogging the network, and because of most of the information in the network was in fact retransmissions, the good put or the useful information fell by orders of magnitude. So the network was no longer performing very well at all. This was a great mystery at the time, a bit of a puzzle as to how the network could have gotten into this state, why it seemed to be stable and persisting, and of course what could be done to ensure that the network would run properly. Enter this man, Van Jacobson. Van Jacobson is widely credited with saving the internet from congestion collapse in the late 80s. He introduced many of the principles of congestion control that we talk about to this day, as well as coming up with practical solutions in the form of new versions of TCP, TCP Tahoe and TCP Reno, other well-known versions. These versions of TCP didn't use a fixed size sliding window. They used a dynamically sized sliding window, adjusting it to operate the network and control to control the allocation of bandwidth in the network and avoid congestion. Van Jacobson's well known in the networking community, and he's done a lot of other pioneering work that you might have heard of. Some of the tools we've used before, like traceroute, for instance, were developed by Van Jacobson. And you can see a few other things here. He's also worked on IP header compression and multicast tools. So TCP Tahoe and Reno really try to avoid congestion collapse under some pretty heavy constraints. The task here that Van Jacobson took on was really to avoid this congestion collapse without changing any of the routers in the network or even the receivers, just by upgrading the logic, the protocol logic at the senders. If you could do this, and he could, it has a tremendous advantage over other schemes in that we don't have to replace and go and fix the whole network. We can just update a little bit of software on the hosts at the edge of the network where they're sending traffic into the network. So it's great if you can do it. And the idea which he came up with to be able to do this did a couple of things. One of the things it did was it fixed the timeouts. And we've looked earlier at the adaptive timeout that took into account the mean and the variance. But in addition to this, the real key innovation that Van Jacobson introduced was the notion of a congestion window on top of the sliding window. We talked about a flow control window which changed dynamically to prevent the sender from overflowing the receiver. The congestion window is the same kind of adaptive sliding window which changes to prevent the sender from overrunning the network. It prevents the sender from filling up those queues in the network and causing loss. We just need to work out what this, how this congestion window should behave. We already know part of the answer in that we would like the congestion window to produce additive increase, multiplicative decrease changes in the bandwidth allocation, because we know that will get the network to a good point. TCP Tahoe and Reno use a set of mechanisms to adapt the congestion window to implement AIMD. And they do this using only packet loss as a signal from the network. This is very clever because, of course, the routers in the network already lost packets when they were overloaded. So that signal already existed, hence there was no need to update the routers in the network. Now TCP has many different mechanisms in it which collectively implement AIMD. In fact, TCP is one of those protocols where there's no real clean specification. The specification is the implementation, so it gets a little hairy. In what follows, we're going to go through the main mechanisms, but understand that I'm not trying to tell you all of the fine little details because, well, many of them don't matter because they could have been done differently. It's just a little hard because the specification and the implementation are completely intertwined in the old internet. But we'll look at several different behaviors as important. Actually, we've already looked at this one, the adaptive timeout, where we kept an estimator for the mean and variance and then formed the timeout as some multiple of them. What we'll look at in the following segments are mechanisms for what's called ACK clocking, slow start, fast retransmission, and fast recovery. They're all very colourful names, but they describe important concepts which help TCP to realize that AIMD sawtooth and arrive at a good allocation. And here are just a couple of slides on timelines to give you some sense of TCP history before we dive into it, so you'll know which bit we're really covering. TCP first existed, I guess, when Cerf and Kahn wrote a paper on a protocol for packet network interconnection. This really proposed the precursor, a protocol which eventually split into TCP and IP. And you can see the split is complete by about 81 when we have RFCs for these different protocols. In this period, really the emphasis was on getting the basics of the architecture right and focusing on reliability to make it actually work. For instance, the three-way handshake we looked at in TCP was proposed in 75. And by 83, the internet, or the ARPANET, had a flag day and changed over such that TCP was used as the main protocol for some of this end-to-end transport across the internet work, rather than the earlier protocols. So TCP was up and running in what would become the internet. This is the prehistory. Starting in about 86, as the internet grew and began to be used more, congestion collapse was observed. So the protocols worked for reliability, but the performance was terrible under some circumstances, which really was this strange situation that everyone wanted to understand and then fix. Van Jacobson is the guy who devised a very practical solution to them and released it onto the internet. It became part of the standard software base, and so then all of the hosts on the internet were able to work together and achieve a fair and efficient allocation, reasonably anyhow. Fairness is, maybe only approximate. And this happened in 88, first with TCP Tahoe, and then quickly with TCP Reno in 1990, which finally implemented AIMD. Now, if we proceed a little bit along the history, well, for maybe the first 10 years or so, we went through a phase where work on classic congestion control was further refined. TCP Reno eventually shifted to New Reno, which used slightly better heuristics to recover from losses. A little later than TCP Reno, a mechanism called SAC, which we've already looked at, selective acknowledgement, provided cleaner information about packet loss to make these versions of classic TCP run more effectively. But in addition, Threads also got started on some other kind of work. TCP Vegas was one of the first schemes which used delay-based feedback from the network instead of packet loss. This has some advantages if you can do it. And we also looked at router support. Sally Floyd in about 94 introduced explicit congestion notification where routers would send indications of congestion to hosts at the edge of the network. These two schemes introduced new capabilities which over time have had a big impact on congestion control. You can see here actually that it's taken quite an amount of time. It's only really in the 2000s that some of the impacts of delay-based and router support schemes have been felt on congestion control. And we're really now in a phase of diversification where there is no single form of classic congestion control, but many different kinds of congestion control where people have come up with slightly different algorithms that they prefer. In Linux, we have now TCP cubic from an earlier TCP BIC design. These are really descendants of New Reno. They use different algorithms, so they're not really AIMD exactly. They're something slightly different, but they're based on packet loss. On the other hand, we have other algorithms which have really begun to use some of the delay-based schemes to be able to scale more effectively and maintain good performance for fast networks. Fast TCP is one of those, and it's based on sort of control theory to make sure that it will scale well. And Windows uses a form of TCP called compound TCP, which uses delay-based feedback as well as packet loss. In addition, there are all sorts of variations on congestion control that are going on. The IETF has concluded work on a protocol called TCP-LEDBAT, which is a little strange, but this is all about background TCP transfers, which soak up excess capacity, say for your big downloads or your Dropbox syncs and all of that, yet they don't get in the way when someone else is trying to actively use the network. Now this is all very interesting that we have this proliferation of schemes. Oh, and also these modern schemes are capable of using both SAC and ECN router support. That's sort of been adopted into all of these schemes. The situation is quite interesting because now we have this diversity of algorithms and they all need to work together to help the network achieve a good operating point. So it's a little like having a family of different actors, and we can begin to ask how they all get on or whether they're a happy family. Whereas the situation was simpler before, when we just had classic TCP congestion control running against itself. Anyhow, we are mostly going to look at the boxes in ping. So we'll study classic congestion control and leave out some of this messy picture where there are many different kinds of variants of TCP as congestion control is diversified. So on with the show.